This is the Leica M11. It is an incredibly expensive but beautiful, amazing camera. And as a longtime Leica user and a former M10 owner, here are the 5 reasons why I decided to finally upgrade from the M10 to the M11. Now, I bought this with my own money. Leica doesn't care that I'm making this video, any of that kind of stuff. These are just my actual thoughts after selling off my M10s and using those funds to purchase this new camera, and really hopefully moving in the direction of letting you know if you are someone that is considering kind of like moving between the M10, M11, even M240. I can give you an idea of like what was important to me in purchasing this camera and whether or not it may or may not be worth it to you. Now, the first reason I picked this up is the dynamic range improvement. If you go to DxO Score, you can see that they've started to use kind of some different sensor technology and some algorithms, the way that they're actually working with their sensors. And the previous M240 and the M10, if you have ever shot those cameras, you know that the highlights clip almost immediately. So you have to shoot them generally like almost a stop underexposed to kind of get a proper exposure in a RAW file at the end of the day. And from what I've seen, at least from the dynamic range tests, and frankly from assuming maybe this is using the same sensor as my Sony a7R5, I've just really liked the dynamic range and the files that I'm getting out of those Sony cameras. And assuming that it seems like the dynamic range is about the same here, as someone who photographs a ton outside and outdoors and in places where I don't have a lot of control over lighting, and I know that a lot of people say like, oh, just use lights or use flash or whatever. You can't do that during a ceremony, and I don't really want to do that during a ceremony. And I really, really don't want to, as much as possible. I would love to not blow out the highlights, and where people fly me to really incredible looking places, the more dynamic range a camera can capture for me, the better. So frankly, dynamic range is number one, the number one reason I ended up purchasing the M11. Number 2, as a wedding photographer, the fact that this camera, despite the fact that it's only 64 gigabytes, the fact that it has internal storage along with the SD card, so you can have some sort of redundancy on this, is a major, major plus. There's only been a couple times where a camera's crapped out on me, and I've never lost files off a card, but just the fact that this has some sort of redundancy within itself, even though it's not necessarily like a full backup or anything like that. And obviously, in my cons about this camera, I will talk about the fact that there have been some software issues with this. But just the idea that I can shoot, let's say, RAW files to an SD card and then even JPEGs to the internal memory, that just gives me a lot of flexibility and more peace of mind over anything. Just in case an SD card fails, I have some sort of backup. And for a wedding photographer, that ends up being a really, really clutch thing to have. All right, number 4, ISO 64. Now, the M10s on the little ISO dial here, they said ISO 100, but make no mistake, you should not be using the M10 at ISO 100. It's basically a pull. So when you are shooting the M10s at ISO 100, you're essentially shooting at ISO 200, and the camera's pulling back the information, and you're losing a full stop of information in the highlights where you already don't have a lot of highlight information. So the fact that this camera goes down to 64 ISO, I do have a 50 Summilux, and I really love using that lens, even for ceremonies and things like that. So there's been times where I've used ND filters, and a lot of times where I've stopped down that lens in situations where I wouldn't necessarily want to, just so that I would get the exposure correct. Now moving this down, I guess a stop and a third from ISO 200 to ISO 64, and having that be a really good, clean base ISO, just is going to be really helpful for me as someone who, likes to shoot at f1.4 in sunlight. Number 4 is just that 61 megapixel sensor. I am the person that used to think that megapixels were stupid. Every time a camera came out and was more megapixels, I'm sure you could go on Twitter or something and find me just like complaining about who cares about megapixels. But like once you have cameras and like multiple cameras now that have higher megapixel counts, and you're finding that you're not really losing a lot to have those, and then the flexibility of those files being so large. Yes, it's larger to deal with for storage, but storage is cheap. And yes, similarly, you can kind of get better low light performance in a way with lower megapixel cameras. Currently with my Sony cameras, I have the A7R5, and then I purchased the A7CR. And so both of those cameras being at pretty much the exact same megapixel count at like 60-ish megapixels as the new M11, it just made so much sense for me to move from the M10, which is at 24 megapixels, to something that is in line with the other cameras I have. It's just really helpful, more consistent. So when I have deliverables to clients, they're going to be getting consistent file sizes instead of some files at a really low megapixel count and then some at a really high megapixel count. It's just really helpful to have some more megapixels. And if you can, yes, you don't need more megapixels, but if you do, it just does give you more flexibility. And finally, to kind of go along with that, the high ISO performance is just better on this camera than even it was on the M10s. I wouldn't say that this is like a low light beast, but it is definitely better than the M10s, even if I want to just dumb this down to 36 megapixels or 18 megapixels. If you were moving this sensor file down to those smaller sizes, the grain gets smaller, the noise gets smaller, all that kind of stuff. Yeah, you can fix some of that with the Lightroom stuff and whatnot. But as a wedding photographer, again, in lower light situations, I have found that, yeah, I just love having a little bit more light. I believe that this is supposed to be like a stop and a third or so better in low light than the M10, and every bit of that counts. So ultimately, those are the 5 reasons that I definitely finally decided to pick it up once it got to a low enough price point on the used market that it made sense financially for me. Now, there are a couple cons, and we'll talk about that. So first of all, if you care about the base plate thing, like I don't really care, but that is a con for some people. You lose out a little bit on that design. And then the other thing is they just had kind of buggy software. So a lot of people talk about the camera freezing up on them. I've obviously had this camera for a day now. It hasn't frozen up on me, but it doesn't mean it won't. So I'm hoping that since I've waited a long enough time, hopefully Leica has fixed the firmware on a lot of these things and will continue to be fixing it if it is still an issue. That being said, I am not the kind of person that is going to go into any sort of shoot that is going to matter at all with only one camera. So I always go into shoot with 2 cameras at minimum, and then I usually have another as a backup somewhere. So if this thing did go down, obviously I'd be super annoyed and it wouldn't be great, but I'm always going to have another camera with me. So I'm not super worried about that, but hopefully isn't an issue. And then obviously the other downside is just the cost. So I sold both of my M10s and have a little bit of money left over after purchasing this as well, but I did have to trade in 2 Leicas that are the same size, form factor, all that kind of stuff to get one of these. So definitely a downside, but as someone who has been using this less as my only primary camera and has been using it more as like an auxiliary camera and something that I just have around my neck all day long, and I use it for a lot of stuff, it's been a good transition for me to start using some more of the Sony stuff for a lot of the more fast-paced things. And then for a lot of the time when things aren't as fast-paced, I'm using this, and it's my kind of main camera for a lot of the day. I'm still using it for a lot of the day, but there are other times where I just didn't need 2 Leicas. And there was a point where I had to send one in to Leica anyway, and I had to just kind of make do at the end of last year. And once I had done that and realized and kind of switched over my workflow to have just one, it just ended up working really well. And so because of that, now I just have one. And yeah, annoying for me, but the cost obviously is going to be a factor for, I would assume, the majority of people out there. So if you are someone like me that really values some of those 5 things, I think that hopefully this is going to be a great camera for me. Obviously, I will be doing lots more content around this camera, but these are kind of just my first thoughts and reasons why I did end up going there. I'll probably do a first impressions video or something after a couple of weeks of use, because I already have a lot of thoughts about this camera after obviously having used the M10 so extensively over the last few years. But to wrap it up, do I think that most people should get this camera even if they're thinking about getting a Leica? Probably not. I think that, like, honestly, the trajectory that I even took on most of my Leica stuff in the last few years makes the most sense to most people. I think the M240 is a really, really good camera to get if you are interested in the Leica system and you want to get the best kind of bang for your buck there. But if you don't like the thicker body that you get there, moving up to the M10 is a really, really good starting point. Just knowing that the highlights blow really fast and some other kind of weird quirks about that camera would be really, really useful. But if you're someone like me that really values some of the newer sensor technology and appreciates some of those gains at those points and some of those kind of diminishing returns, I think for me in my professional work, this is going to be a really, really helpful tool for me. And it's the reason ultimately I decided to sell my M10s, pick up this guy, and we will see if I end up just keeping the one or end up with 2. I might end up with a Q3, a Q2, who knows? But at this point, I'm really, really stoked to finally have this in my hands. Really excited to share more content on it in the future. And if you have any comments or questions about it, let me know in the comments below. Subscribe if you haven't already, and if you're interested in more content on this in the future. And I will see you all on the next one.